Dr. Simon Curtis, welcome to my Hoof Summer Talk. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be able to do this interview with you today. I've been admiring your work from a distance and also joining your webinars a couple of times. You are a kind of a role model to me, actually. But for those who don't know you, I will let you introduce yourself to all the horse people in Sweden. And please let us know who you are, where you live, and how did you end up with hooves?
Okay, that's a lot of questions to answer, Mia. But first of all, thank you for inviting me to this interview with you. It's great being asked, and I will tell you about my affinity with Sweden later. But I left school at 16 in 1972. I wasn't thrown out, but it was suggested to me that I didn't return that summer. And I went and worked for my father, who was a farrier, and after about 10 years, I was getting a little bored. You know, I learned a lot of the skills, but there was not a lot of opportunities then to progress, shall we say. But after that, I found farriers outside my area. I took examinations, and we have 3 tiers in the UK of exams for farriers. So there's, you know, something to aim at each time. I then became interested through, of course, that wonderful institution in England, the pub, of a conversation with a professor who gained his PhD in studying the horse's hoof. And he suggested I should do a degree, and I did a degree part-time. And before I finished my degree, he said, you should do a master's. And the week before I had my interview with the university, he said, do you know, you should really do a PhD. And I said, well, how long will that take? And he said, 6 years. And I thought, oh. But as we know, time passes, and I did it in 5 years. So I gained a PhD studying the growth of foals' hooves. But to gain a PhD, you have to do an awful lot of reading around the subject. And so I studied all hoof growth because there hasn't been enough science. There's probably been 10 good papers written on hoof growth, and so I devoured them. And I never was, as my academic achievements at traditional school show, I was never much of a scholar. But you know, when you're interested in something and when you love it, it's surprising how much you learn and how dedicated you are. And at one point, I was so far ahead of my PhD that the university said, because it was a part-time PhD, so that's why it was 6 years, that I was not allowed to achieve it in under 4 years because they thought I was going so fast. But I did achieve it in 5 years, so I got ahead of the 6-year mark. And that was not many years ago. That was only about 4 years ago that I got that. And so there's hope for everybody with adult learning. I don't know what it's called in Sweden, but you know, we're always encouraged now in the UK for adult learning, and universities love adult students because they're more motivated and we have less distractions, shall we say, you know. And I would like to think we have other distractions, but not the ones that usually distract, shall we say, the 18 to 30-year-old students. So that was a great experience for me. And the last few years, I have been trying to get that information out. So I wrote a book, as many PhD students do, based on what I found. So not just my personal research, but of course, reading around and finding out what everybody else knew about the hoof. And that sells pretty well, and it sells well in Sweden. So the hoof of the horse, I went for the obvious title. I'm a great believer in going for the obvious, Mia. So if you write a book about the hoof of the horse, call it that. And I was going to say my affinity with Sweden. My very first overseas trip to study the hoof was to Helsingborg, And I learned very quickly, because we're talking the mid-80s, I think it was 85 or 86, and I'm not even going to try and pronounce it, but the Regional Animal Hospital there at Helsingborg. But I learned about Helsingborg that they had a saying that the best thing about Helsingborg was Helsinger. And of course, we made the little trip across to Denmark to enjoy, should we say, some Danish beer. So that was my first trip there. And since then, I've probably lectured or given demos in Sweden at least 10 times and maybe as many as 15. So I have a great affinity, probably the country I've traveled to more than anywhere, but it's always been, of course, for farriers and veterinary surgeons and not really the horse owners. But that's a potted version of my history to date, Mia.
Please, will you tell us more about the hoof growth in foal?
Okay, the thing you learn about doing a PhD, and my professor kept saying to me, you have to drill deeper and narrower. In other words, like a funnel, you know, because it's too much just to have a general study. So when I just thought, oh, I'll study hoof growth, he said, no, you have to be a lot tighter than that. So I studied foals because I had the availability of lots of foals because I did lots of stud farm work. And I was particularly interested in how foals get club feet or how mature horses get them during that period. So I had to learn, first of all, to measure hoof growth. The other thing I discovered that nobody had ever suggested before, but nobody ever argues with me. So I think it's one of those things that once you say it to somebody, they realize how obvious it is. So nobody had ever suggested that hoof, after it's been produced at the top of the foot, compresses. So as it grows down, it actually gets closer together. And for all the high technology that my university had, they were flabbergasted when I was able to do it by drilling 2 little holes in the hoof, filling them with glue and photographing them very accurately every month. Obviously, I did lots of foals. I did over 30 foals like that. And in fact, in my studies, I think I studied 300 foals in all, but that particular study, and we could show that it was quite clear and significant proof or a significant finding that hoof horn compressed as it grew down. So that might sound like some sort of, I don't know, something of interest to a hoof nerd, but no other interest. But it explains why hooves change shape. And everybody's interested in that, because by the time we have mature horses, how many horses have exact pairs of hooves? Very, very few. In fact, it's so unusual that usually when we see them as a professional, maybe not as a horse owner, but as a professional, we remark on it. Farriers are always, if you ask them and they say, yeah, I have 100 horses in this yard and there's only one with a perfect pair of hooves.
Yeah.
So we know that they change, and I believe strongly, I can't actually prove it, but I think from observation that foals are born with perfectly formed hooves. So we have to say, well, what either went wrong or what happened between when they're born and when they're 3 or 4 years old, when if you measure them all, as I say, you would find maybe only 1% of horses have, you know, down to a millimeter's difference in width of their hooves on. Some of it is, shall we say, normal, healthy change. And it is quite true that horses in general have a more oblique or more angled on the lateral, on the outside of their hooves, but slightly more upright on the medial or inside. But they don't seem to be born like that. So I think they're just changing because of the natural loading. We already know that foals load more down the inside of the legs and the inside of the hooves, and mature horses do. And we have pressure mats that can show that. So I use lots of pressure mats. So I was able to put my foals on pressure mats. I was able to measure the hoof growth, and I was able to measure this compression. So that's 3 things. And all the statistical analysis, and this was the bit I found hardest, but we had lots of help at university, all the statistical analysis showed a clear link between those three things. Now, can we assume that that happens with mature horses? I think we can. I think, you know, foals are very dynamic. That's why it's lovely to study them. Everything that happens to a mature horse happens 3 times as fast to a foal. It almost, you can always see it changing in front of your eyes. So you can learn things on foals that you can then apply to mature horses. And why the compression is really important, and I've tried to get this message over, and I've noticed certainly in the English-speaking world, amongst farriers that are really keen on this, it has entered the language about hoof compression. So I have achieved that. And why it's important is that, shall we say we have a horse that slightly toes in and is a little bit narrower at the bottom, base narrow as we call it. Mm-hmm. You really don't need a pressure mat to look at it and say, I think this bears more weight on the lateral wall. You know, no more than, you don't have to be an architect to see the Leaning Tower of Pisa is leaning over. So some things we can see that might not sound scientific, but the point is that if we can alleviate some of that stress on the outside, either by our trimming or shoeing or in combination, then we may be able to get some correction in this shape. And I believe that strongly. Now, my foals that the foals that I studied that had a health issue, so I had a group of healthy foals that I could measure their hooves, and I could compare them with foals that were getting flexural deformities. In other words, these foals where the heel comes up off the ground or it's not bearing weight much there. And I was able to compare their hoof growth with my healthy ones. And there was quite extreme differences. And so although we would tend to think that a clubfoot is because the heel is growing faster than the toe, I would suggest that in some ways it's the toe that is compressing and the heel is just growing because it's not under loading. So it's a different way of looking at it. And once we understand a process, we have more chance of correcting that if it needs correcting, because we're then starting to do things that have a more rational reason. So that's where my research took me, when they were born to when they grew out that hoof that they were born with. So how long does it take a foal to renew its hoof? So we've only got one, it sounds bizarre, one scientific study of mature horses, and that was, I should remember her name, shouldn't I? Henrietta, anyway, who was a German or an Austrian scientist. And she said that horses renew their hooves on average at 11 months. And I think that's, you know, most of us would say a year, and we wouldn't be far wrong. But she found it was 11 months, 335 days. My foals grew a new hoof in 145 days, almost 3 times as quickly.
Wow, amazing.
And that was fairly consistent. And I did do some slightly older ones. So I did some horses that were 300 to 450 days of age. So about a year to 18 months, that sort of. And they were still a lot quicker than the mature horses, but they had slowed considerably. And of course, you have to say, once you find something, it doesn't stop there, because you have to ask the question, why? You know, why does this happen? And I did get the answer from some people, well, everything with foals is quick, which is what I've said, but that doesn't explain it. I'm not sure if their tails are growing 3 times as quick, you know. And I don't know if in Sweden you have 2 different words. One of the problems in English is we use the word growing for 2 reasons. In other words, that foal is getting bigger, it's growing. But we then use it for example, our fingernails and our hair, which is growing as well. But it's not getting bigger, it's just producing more and more and continually. So I think that helped mix this up. So you're going to ask me why I think they grow so fast, aren't you?
That's my next question. That's my next question.
Okay, Why do I think they grow so fast? I think there's two conceivable answers. One is that we've got to think of these foals in nature, and I know there's very few foals in nature. Australia, of course, has this huge number, 1 million brumbies running about in various environments. But of course, the foal is born, it's a healthy foal, stands up in 30 minutes, suckles from its mother. And if the mother is moving with the herd, the foal has to move with her. It's one of the remarkable things about horses. You think about human beings, I'm told that children lay there for the first 6 or 8 months screaming, laying on their backs. I have got 4 children of my own, but I always manage to avoid witnessing this. Anyway, foals don't do that. They, as with all big herbivores, they have to avoid predators. So they get up and go, they follow their mothers. Now, their mother has a nice thick wall of about 11 millimeters, and that little foal is born with a hoof wall of 2 to 3 millimeters. And you might say, well, the foal's a lot smaller, but actually proportionately, very rapidly, the weight of the foal, if it's in a healthy environment and it's suckling off its mother, proportionately the foot is a lot smaller on it than the mother's foot. So it's going the same distance. It must be wearing quicker, mustn't it? That's what I would think. It must be eroding its hoof quicker than its mother. And in order to cope with that, it grows an awful lot quicker. So that's one reason. The second reason is this. If we look at a radiograph of a horse's foot, of course, we know the horse has a single toe. And again, this unusual thing about our horses, nobody ever thinks of them like this, but they're more like spiders, aren't they? They have a single toe on a leg. And it's encapsulated in the fingernail. See, my fingernail, I have to be careful which way around I put my finger here, but we're not in America, so it's okay. My fingernail is only about 30%, maybe less than that, around my finger. But the hoof capsule, apart from the movable bit at the back, but even that is pretty tightly across the back, tightly held. So this bone here, this third phalanx, is trapped in this hoof capsule. I actually think it's like a snake shedding a skin. It has to grow quickly to get off and get out of the way and allow this bone to grow, because it's holding it too tight. So I think there's those two reasons. And I always say when I give lectures to the audience, if you can think of another, please tell me. So far, nobody's come up with another, but I would be quite happy to hear another theory of why foals think, what do I think produces the best quality hooves?
Yeah.
There you go.
Perfect.
So, in Sweden, you have a variety of soils just like we do here. The ideal soil for the hoof is a sandy soil. Maybe you don't have many sandy soils, but people hate it in the UK because it doesn't grow very good grass. But I can tell you they have the best hooves because they're never really standing in water. It drains well. So sandy soil, and then bedding. And the only important thing for most horse owners, so I can't change their idea of that, is respiratory problems. So, you know, the less dust in the bedding in the stable, the happier they are. But I have to tell you that the best bedding for the hoof is wood shavings. And I don't know if much wood shavings is used in Sweden.
Yeah, we have it.
But that's the best. And the real best, and I know you have lots of pine trees, is pine wood bedding shavings. So that's my ideal world. And I know most people, horse owners, don't get to choose the environment. They keep the horse where they live or near where they live, and they have the environment that they are given. Yeah. But if you have a chance to choose sandy soil and wood shavings beddings, it really produces far better hooves.
What a great advice.
Okay.
So I thank you for taking your time talking to us. And I wish you a very, very nice summer.
That's very nice of you, Mia. And once all this nonsense is over, I will be back in Sweden. So thank you.
Absolutely. And you're more than welcome.
Thank you. Bye
Thank
then.
you.